안녕하세요.
The Kang family mansion stood like a fortress atop a hill, its sleek glass windows reflecting the Seoul skyline. Inside, everything was pristine polished marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and the quiet hum of wealth that demanded absolute obedience. Kang Ji-ho had learned from a young age that his world was one of expectations. As the 25-year-old CEO of Kang Enterprises, he had never been allowed to make mistakes. Every decision, every relationship, every aspect of his life had been meticulously planned by his parents, including his engagement to Han Soo-min, the heiress of another corporate empire. It wasn't love. It wasn't even friendship. Their engagement was a business merger disguised as tradition, a bond forged between two families who valued wealth over happiness. Ji-ho had long since accepted that emotions had no place in his world. Or so he thought. From his second-floor office, Ji-ho loosened his tie and stared out the window, his mind heavy with the weight of his responsibilities. A sudden movement in the garden below caught his attention. He narrowed his eyes. Yoon Ha-na. She moved through the garden effortlessly, adjusting the small flower pots with delicate hands. The daughter of the mansion's housekeeper, she had lived in the small servants' quarters behind the estate for as long as he could remember. Unlike the other staff, she never seemed to shrink under the weight of the Kang family's presence. Ji-ho had barely noticed her growing up, but now, something about her presence unsettled him. She was nothing like the women in his world, no expensive dresses, no carefully rehearsed smiles, no fear of speaking her mind. A knock on his office door pulled him from his thoughts. "Your father wants to see you, sir." Ji-ho sighed and straightened his suit. He already knew what this was about. The meeting room was vast and cold, dominated by a long mahogany table where Chairman Kang sat at the head, his gaze sharp and unreadable. Across from him, Han Soo-min waited, her elegant hands folded neatly in her lap. "Ji-ho, the wedding date has been finalized." His father's voice was firm, leaving no room for negotiation. Ji-ho clenched his jaw but nodded. "I see." Soo-min studied him, her lips curving into a small, practiced smile. "I hope we can get along, Ji-ho." It was the same line she had given him when they first met. Polite, empty. "I hope so too." The conversation moved to logistics, family ties, and corporate shares. Ji-ho barely listened. This was his reality, a future laid out before him like an unbreakable contract. And yet, his mind kept drifting to her, to Ha-na, the girl who lived in the shadows of his world yet remained untouched by it. That night, unable to sleep, Ji-ho wandered through the mansion. He had spent years suppressing emotions, but now something restless stirred within him. As he passed through the dimly lit halls, he heard soft footsteps in the distance. He followed the sound and found himself near the side garden. The scent of freshly watered flowers filled the air, and there, under the glow of the moonlight, stood Ha-na. She turned at the sound of his approach, her expression unreadable. "You should be sleeping, young master." Ji-ho's lips twitched at her lack of formality. "And yet, here you are, awake as well." Ha-na arched an eyebrow but said nothing, returning her attention to the potted plants before her. Ji-ho knew he should walk away. There was no reason to linger. And yet, something about her presence made him pause. "You spend a lot of time in this garden. It's quiet here." She glanced at him. "You wouldn't understand." Ji-ho frowned. "Try me." Ha-na studied him for a long moment before sighing. "This place is a prison, but at least here, in the garden, I can pretend it isn't." Ji-ho's chest tightened. It wasn't the response he expected, but somehow it was exactly what he needed to hear. Because, for the first time, he realized something shocking. He wasn't the only one trapped inside this golden cage. Days passed in a blur of corporate meetings, wedding preparations, and endless expectations. Ji-ho followed the routine like a machine, nodding at the right moments, answering in calculated tones. But his mind was elsewhere. He found himself in the garden more often, drawn to Ha-na's quiet presence. He told himself it was coincidence, yet each night, he took the same path, lingering in the shadows as she cared for the flowers. It was reckless, dangerous even, but he couldn't seem to stop. One evening, After another tiresome dinner with Sue, Min's family, Ji-ho stepped outside, seeking fresh air. The house was quiet. The staff retired for the night. A dim light glowed from the garden, where Ha-na sat on a stone bench, reading by the faint illumination of a lamp. "You read at night?" She glanced up, unfazed by his presence. "You wander at night?" A smirk tugged at his lips. "I could ask you the same question." Closing the book, she traced its edges absent-mindedly. "Books don't demand anything from me. No expectations, no obligations, just stories." Ji-ho studied her, something unfamiliar tightening in his chest. "And reality?" Her gaze flickered toward the mansion. "Reality reminds me that stories like these don't belong to people like me." Her words unsettled him. He had spent years believing he was the only one trapped in this world, suffocated by expectations. Yet, Ha-na, living in the shadows of his house, felt the same. "Have you ever thought of leaving?" Ha-na hesitated before offering a faint smile. What would be the point? The world outside still belongs to people like you. Ji-ho didn't know why that stung. Before he could reply, she stood up. "You should go, young master. If they see you here, they'll start asking questions." She walked past him, disappearing into the darkness, leaving behind the scent of jasmine and the quiet chaos she had awakened in him. The next day, Ji-ho sat through an important business meeting, but his focus wavered. Ha-na's words echoed in his mind. "The world outside still belongs to people like you." For the first time, he questioned everything. That night, as he passed the main hall, he spotted Ha-na speaking in hushed tones with her mother near the kitchen. The older woman looked nervous, wringing her hands. Ji-ho's instincts sharpened. Something was wrong. Ha-na noticed him, her expression freezing before she whispered something to her mother and slipped away. Ji-ho should have ignored it, should have gone to bed, like a proper heir to an empire. But instead, he followed her. She moved through the corridors like a shadow, eventually stepping into a dimly lit storage room. Ji-ho hesitated only for a moment before pushing the door open. Ha-na didn't turn. "You shouldn't be here, Ji-ho." It was the first time she had said his name, and something about it felt irreversible. Ji-ho took a slow breath. "Then tell me the truth." Finally, she turned, her expression unreadable. "The truth?" Her voice was quiet but firm. "The truth is, you were never supposed to notice me." Ji-ho had spent his life surrounded by people who obeyed him or wanted something from him. Ha-na was neither, and that made her the most dangerous of all. After that night, Ji-ho tried to avoid Ha-na. He convinced himself it was a temporary distraction, something he could control. But the more he tried to push her from his mind, the more his thoughts drifted back to her, the quiet defiance in her eyes, the way her words unsettled him. He was engaged. His life was planned. She didn't fit into any of it. And yet, he found himself searching for her in the quiet corners of the mansion. One afternoon, as he walked through the garden, he caught sight of her carrying a basket of fresh linens toward the back of the estate. She moved quickly, as if trying to remain unseen. Ji-ho clenched his fists and turned away. She was right. He should never have noticed her. That evening, Ji-ho attended a formal gala with Soo-min. The entire event was orchestrated to showcase their upcoming wedding-perfect smiles, practiced gestures, a picture-perfect engagement. Yet, Ji-ho barely registered any of it. As he sipped his drink, his father approached, his expression sharp. "Tomorrow morning, Sue, Min's family will visit the mansion for final wedding discussions. Be on time. No distractions." Ji-ho nodded automatically. Distractions. Ha-na's face flashed in his mind, and something twisted in his chest. The next morning, the estate was filled with the chatter of high society. Soo-min arrived with her family, discussing floral arrangements and luxury venues. Ji-ho remained silent, watching from the sidelines. But then, movement near the staircase caught his attention. Ha-na stood at the far end of the hall, carrying a silver tray of tea, her expression carefully neutral. She kept her gaze lowered, her presence barely acknowledged by the guests. Still, Ji-ho saw her. As she turned to leave, their eyes met for a brief Sikenso brief that no one else noticed. But Ji-ho felt it, The same tension from that night in the storage room. The same pull he was trying so hard to resist. His father's voice snapped him back to reality. Ji-ho, are you listening? He forced himself to focus. Yes, continue. But his thoughts were elsewhere, trapped in the gaze of a girl he could never have. Late that night, Ji-ho found himself in the hallway leading to the servants' quarters. He told himself he was simply walking, clearing his mind. But when he saw Ha-na outside, stacking supplies near the storage room, he knew better. She noticed him immediately, her posture stiffening. Young master, you shouldn't be here. Ji-ho exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Do you always follow the rules? She narrowed her eyes. I have to. People like me don't get second chances. Ji-ho stepped closer, his voice quiet. And if you could leave? If you didn't have to stay here? Ha-na's fingers tightened around the cloth she was holding. Then I'd go. Her answer was immediate, but her voice wavered. Ji-ho caught at the hesitation beneath her certainty. She wanted to believe she could leave, but something held her back. A silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken truths. Forget I asked. Ji-ho turned to leave. But before he could take another step, she spoke. What about you? He paused. What? Ha-na swallowed. If you could leave your world, would you? Ji-ho had never considered it. His life was mapped out before he was even born. His responsibilities weren't a choice. They were an expectation. For the first time, he realized he didn't have an answer. Ha-na studied him, her expression softening. That's what I thought. She stepped back into the shadows, leaving Ji-ho standing alone. And for the first time in his life, he wondered what it would mean to want something just for himself. Ji-ho tried to shake off the weight of Ha-na's words, but they stayed with him like an echo he couldn't silence. For days, he buried himself in work, meetings, and wedding preparations. He told himself he was doing what was expected, that his life had already been decided. But no matter how many contracts he signed, or corporate deals he finalized, nothing filled the emptiness inside him. And Ha-na was still there, always there. She moved through the mansion like a ghost, never drawing attention, never speaking unless spoken to. But Ji-ho noticed everything: the way she avoided his gaze, the way she hesitated whenever he was near, the way she gripped the edges of her apron when nervous. She was just as trapped as he was. One evening, unable to stand the silence any longer, Ji-ho walked toward the back of the mansion. The sun had set, and the garden was bathed in the glow of soft lanterns. Ha-na stood near the greenhouse, watering the plants. Ji-ho approached without a word. She noticed him but didn't move away. How long do you plan to keep avoiding me? His voice was low, but firm. Ha-na exhaled, setting the watering can down. I'm not avoiding you, young master. Ji-ho sighed. Then say my name. She hesitated. Ji-ho. His chest tightened. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear that. Ha-na turned to him, arms crossed. Why are you here? You're getting married. Shouldn't you be with your fiancé? Ji-ho clenched his jaw. Shouldn't you be honest with me? Ha-na froze, her expression unreadable. What are you talking about? Ji-ho stepped closer, lowering his voice. I saw you that night with your mother. She was worried. Something is wrong. Na's breath hitched. She looked away, gripping the edge of the table beside her. It's nothing. You're lying. Silence. Ji-ho watched as she struggled with herself, as if deciding whether to trust him. Finally, she sighed. My mother? She's being forced to leave. Ji-ho's stomach dropped. What? Why? Ha-na swallowed hard. The chairman says we've been here too long. He's giving my mother 2 weeks to pack everything and leave. Ji-ho felt his blood turn cold. And you? Ha-na's lips pressed into a thin line. Wherever she goes, I go. That's how it's always been. Ji-ho's heart pounded. He knew his father was ruthless. But this? He stared at Ha-na, something breaking inside him. That's not fair. She let out a hollow laugh. Fair? Ji-ho, nothing about my life has ever been fair. He clenched his fists. This wasn't right. And for the first time, Ji-ho realized something dangerous. He didn't want her to go. That night, Ji-ho confronted his father. "You're forcing Ha-na and her mother out?" Chairman Kang didn't even blink. "It's time. They've served us well, but their place is elsewhere. This is not their home." Ji-ho's stomach churned. "And if I tell you I don't want them to leave?" His father's sharp eyes settled on him. "Then I would ask why a Kang heir would care so much about a mere servant." The unspoken accusation hung in the air. Ji-ho felt his pulse spike. His father wasn't just testing him. He knew. "You have a fiancé, a duty to this family." Chairman Kang's voice was cold now. "If you value your position, you'll let this go." Ji-ho's chest tightened. He had always known he was expected to follow the rules, to obey without question. But now, for the first time in his life, he was being forced to choose. His family, or Ha-na. As he left the office, his father's final words echoed in his mind. "If you cross this line, you are no longer a son of mine." Ji-ho's hands trembled as he walked back to his room. For the first time in his life, he had to decide who he truly was. And time was running out. The weight of his father's words pressed heavily on Ji-ho's chest. "If you cross this line, you are no longer a son of mine." For years, Ji-ho had been Controlda's future, written before he had the chance to dream of another path. He was born into a world where loyalty meant obedience, where love was a negotiation, and where people like Ha-na existed only in the background. But now, with each passing second, the realization burned deeper. He couldn't let her go. The next morning, Ji-ho found Ha-na in the storage room, quietly folding linens. She barely glanced at him. "You shouldn't be here." Ji-ho ignored the warning. "I need to talk to you." She let out a tired sigh but didn't stop what she was doing. "You heard, didn't you? My mother and I are leaving." Ji-ho swallowed hard. "You don't have to." At that, Ha-na finally looked at him, her expression unreadable. And how would that work exactly? He hesitated, the reality of his situation crashing down. If she stayed, she would always be seen as nothing more than a servant. His father would never accept her. His world would never make room for her. But still, he wanted to fight for her. "I'll talk to my father. I'll find a way." Ha-na shook her head, her voice softer now. "Ji-ho, your father doesn't change his mind, and neither does this world." Her words hit hard. He had spent his whole life following the rules, and now, standing here, he realized he had never truly fought for anything. Until now. "Then I'll leave with you." The words came out before he could stop them. Ha-na froze, her eyes widening. "What?" Ji-ho stepped closer, determination rising inside him. "If you go, I go. I won't let him control my life anymore." She stared at him, a mix of shock and something else fear. "Ji-ho, do you even know what you're saying? You don't know what it's like to live without wealth, without security. Your life is here. You belong here." Ji-ho clenched his fists. "I belong where I can be free, and that's not here." Ha-na looked away, conflict clear in her expression. "I can't ask you to do that." "You're not asking. I'm choosing." The silence between them stretched, heavy and unspoken. That night, Chairman Kang called for Ji-ho once again. "You've had time to think. I assume you've come to your senses." Ji-ho took a slow breath, forcing his hands to remain steady. "I have." His father nodded approvingly. "Good. The wedding will proceed as planned. I'm leaving." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Chairman Kang's expression darkened. "You don't know what you're saying." "I do. For the first time, I do." His father exhaled sharply, his gaze turning colder. "If you walk away from this family, you walk away from everything. Your name, your inheritance, your company. You will be nothing." Ji-ho's heart pounded. The reality of what he was about to do finally settled in. He had spent his entire life being Kang Ji-ho, the heir, the perfect son, the obedient businessman. But now, for the first time, he wasn't just Kang Ji-ho. He was Ji-ho, a man choosing love over power, freedom over control. His father's voice was ice. "If you leave, don't come back." Ji-ho swallowed, his chest tightening. But then, he thought of Ha-na. He thought of the way she looked at him, not with expectation, not with greed, but with truth. And suddenly, the choice wasn't difficult at all. Without another word, Ji-ho turned and walked out of his father's office. For the first time, he was free. The Kang mansion loomed behind him, like a shadow of the life Ji-ho was leaving behind. The halls that once felt coldly familiar now felt suffocating, pressing in on him with the weight of expectation, power, and duty. His father's final words still echoed in his mind. If you leave, don't come back. And yet, for the first time in his life, Ji-ho felt no fear, only certainty. He wasn't just walking away from wealth. He was walking toward freedom. Ji-ho strode toward the servants' quarters, his heartbeat steady, his decision final. He expected Ha-na to argue, to hesitate, but when he entered the small room, he was met with something far worse. Ha-na and her mother were already packed. Their few belongings fit into a couple of worn suitcases, neatly stacked by the door. They were leaving, with or without him. Ha-na looked up as he entered, and for the briefest moment, something flickered in her eyes, relief, maybe even longing. But it was gone just as quickly, replaced by a cold resolve. You shouldn't be here. Ji-ho took a slow breath, stepping forward. I'm coming with you. Her mother gasped, her expression shifting between confusion and fear. Ha-na, however, didn't react the way he expected. She didn't cry. She didn't soften. She hardened. No, you're not. The words hit him like ice. Ji-ho frowned. What? Ha-na crossed her arms. You don't belong in my world, Ji-ho, and I don't belong in yours. The words should have been a rejection, but he could see it in her eyes. This wasn't what she wanted. She was pushing him away. Ji-ho stepped closer, his voice low but firm. That's not your choice to make. Ha-na exhaled sharply, shaking her head. Do you even understand what you're doing? You're leaving behind everything, your company, your fortune, your security. Ji-ho's jaw tightened. Then teach me how to live without them. Ha-na's mother looked between them, then placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. We need to go, Ha-na. Ha-na hesitated, and in that moment, Ji-ho saw the truth. She wanted him to fight for her, not just in whispered conversations, not just in stolen glances, but completely. A loud knock echoed from the front door. Ha-na's mother inhaled sharply. They're here. Ji-ho's stomach twisted. His father hadn't wasted any time. Hurry! We have to leave now. Ha-na grabbed her suitcase, but before she could step outside, Ji-ho took her wrist. Run with me. She froze, looking up at him. Ji-ho, his grip tightened. Now, a second later, the front door burst open, and 2 security guards stormed in. Ji-ho didn't wait. He pulled Ha-na with him, dodging through the narrow back alley behind the servants' quarters. The rain had started falling, turning the pavement slick beneath their feet. They ran, through dark streets, past unfamiliar neighborhoods, the weight of their past chasing them like shadows. For the first time in his life, Ji-ho wasn't running toward power. He was running toward freedom. By the time they reached the outskirts of the city, they were breathless, soaked to the bone, and trembling from the adrenaline. A train station stood in front of them, a departure board flickering with destinations. Ji-ho turned to Ha-na, searching her face for any hesitation. If you don't want this, tell me now. Ha-na looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she reached for his hand. Fingers laced together, a silent answer. A train rumbled to a stop before them. The doors opened. Ji-ho took a deep breath, stepping inside first. He turned, holding out his hand for Ha-na. She stared at it for a long moment. A final hesitation. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she took it. And together, they left behind the world that had tried to define them. As the train moved, the city lights blurred into the distance. Ji-ho exhaled, his grip on Ha-na's hand never loosening. For the first time, there were no expectations, no business deals, no arranged futures. Only them. And for Ji-ho, that was finally enough. Because some stories don't end. They simply turn the page to a new chapter.
You're my eternal gloom, a rose that breaks the gloom. In your arms I'm home, never again. with